I think, very beautiful pieces of your message is around the importance of not dehumanizing others. And, when I think of like global warming, and I think of like the oil and gas executive that wakes up in the morning, even that person, I don't think wakes up in the morning with the intention of, I'm going to warm the globe today.
Right.
Let's see, 1,415 parts per million. By the end of the day, 420. Like nobody is doing that. No one. But in the absence of a new story, of essentially what I think of are values, he goes to work, and then that's the natural output. In the absence of values, medical innovation gets used for the pharmaceutical industry that just essentially keeps people on drugs instead of off of drugs. Agricultural innovation goes to sponsored by Monsanto instead of actually feeding the people of the world. And I wonder if you think that that is essentially what this new story is potentially about. Is it about the reinstilling of a value-based society or value-based culture that then will change consciousness, and then all of those things will change? Leaders, laws, policies, platforms?
Not so much.
No.
No. I think that, most people hold beautiful universal values. It's that the story hijacks the values and diverts our creative energies toward things that pretend to serve those values, but actually do not. Yeah, and it's true that values also do evolve and deepen over time. But it's, as you were saying, it's not that the oil company executive does not value peace, love, fulfillment, beauty, truth. If you could extract him from the reinforcing circumstances of his life, then you could probably have just as, you could take Donald Trump, and if you got him in the right situation, you could have a beautiful conversation with him. So the question is, what are the circumstances that pervert those values or redirect those values, hijack those values?
Right. Yeah. I think it goes back to separation that then always induces some sort of self-interested behavior. So do you know this guy, Stephen West? He hosts a podcast called Philosophize This. Really great. And he was talking about this, I guess you'd call him a political theorist, John Rawls.
Yeah,
who,
right. Theory of justice, yeah.
Right, and distributive justice and things like that. And he brings up this example, I think it was quite interesting, which is like, let's say you've got a whole group of people over at your house, or you're even Donald Trump, and you get delivered a pizza from a pizza guy. And you like open the box and you're like, oh, but wait, this pizza looks great, but it's not cut up. It's just one big pie that hasn't been cut up. And your job is to cut the pizza up. But with the caveat is you don't know what piece you're going to end up with. So how do you cut it up?
Right.
And I think, you can answer the question for yourself, but I think even Donald Trump might make this calculation of like, well, it's a socialist cut up. It's like, I'm going to cut it up evenly because I don't know what piece I'm going to end up with, right?
Right.
But that's not how distributive justice functions. That essentially you end up with a big piece, or you start with a big piece, or you start with a small piece. And then, it's up to us to figure out how to create a sense of justice around that. And I bring that up because I think that the most visible badge of separation right now in modern culture is like income inequality,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and polarization, atomization.
Yeah. Okay. So you brought up dehumanization, and I didn't really address that. And then you're bringing up John Rawls. These are actually connected because, as you're illustrating with the pizza metaphor, what John Rawls said is that the just society is one where you set it up and you don't know which role you're going to be. Your role is assigned randomly.
Right.
So what society would you choose knowing that you don't know who you're going to be? That, and it's a very beautiful idea.
Yes.
And it taps into the understanding that we are all on some level of equal worth, that everybody should have a fair lot.
Right.
And that somebody who's in some miserable sweatshop doesn't deserve that any more than you would deserve it. Like, you're not better or worse than any other person. Dehumanization is a necessary, I would even call it a prerequisite for an unjust society. You have to have some way to explain to yourself why someone deserves to be a slave, or why it's okay that this person is working behind the counter at Sbarro, and I'm, getting on a first-class flight to Tahiti. Like,
right.
Yeah, otherwise the incongruity of that is disturbing. Yeah. So dehumanization is necessary for an unjust society to operate. And the habits, one of the big problems, so if we accept that dehumanization is at the root of a lot of our social problems, and it's certainly at the root of warfare, it's again universal. You have to dehumanize the enemy, demonize the enemy even, associate them with evil in order to justify bombing them and killing them.
Right.
And this pattern of thought, this habit of perception called dehumanization, is so pervasive that people employ it even in service to healing the effects of dehumanization.
Yeah.
So they employ dehumanization as a way to arouse hatred and indignation at those oil companies. If I were one of those executives, I wouldn't be doing that. I wouldn't wake up in the morning feeling good about my work. I wouldn't sacrifice the future of the whole planet for my own greed. Like, you muster a story like that, and then you get people really so riled up at this diabolical enemy that they will do anything it takes to tear them down, and the problem is solved. So it taps into the belief that the solution to a problem is to kill something. That is also characteristic of modern medicine and modern agriculture, and even to some extent modern spirituality. So you can see like how all-encompassing this way of thinking is,
Yeah.
and therefore how deep the revolution is that we want to undergo.
Right. Yes. And so, playing that forward a bit, if you're, I suppose, fashion yourself a conscious human being or an aware human being, how would then you go about addressing injustices that you see in the world that then are perpetuated by certain roles or figureheads or models, whether that be Mr. Exxon, Mr. Trump, whatever, essentially without dehumanizing? What is the approach?
Well, if you want to, yeah. So, I'll preface this by saying that sometimes it might be necessary to fight Mr. Exxon or Mr. Trump.
Yes.
But even if that's the case, your fight is going to be more effective if you actually understand this person and why they're doing what they're doing, rather than abdicating any attempt to explain it by saying, well, they're just bad.
Right.
When you say they're just bad, you're you're resisting any attempt to explain, to understand. There's no understanding there. It's a substitute for understanding. So even if you are going to fight them, demonizing them in your own mind is a liability.
Right.
And it also forecloses any possibility of any other response besides fighting. But if you understand, what is it that makes a Donald Trump? What are the totality of circumstances that causes the fracking executive to do what he's doing?
Right.
Then you have other options besides defeating that person. You can also maybe find some way to change the conditions. If you don't do that, if you don't understand the conditions that create a Donald Trump, and I'm not wanting to name him as the bogeyman here.
Yeah, sure.
I've never met the guy. He might, I mean, who knows?
By many accounts, he's lovely in person.
Yeah. But if you don't examine those circumstances, even if you do take him down, guess what? The circumstances are still there. You're going to get a new Donald Trump.
Right.
Or somebody, some new occupant of a role that is systemically necessary.
Yes. Yeah. I often hear this kind of nostalgia for Barack Obama, and then which also brings me to the point of actually, well, nostalgia actually means our pain, but that the good old days of a leader that was graceful, compassionate, without controversy, but then of course the conditions for our current situation were essentially that soil was cultivated over that period of time. So it's not fair to be kind of looking at figureheads per se and saying and attributing human condition to various figureheads when you're not addressing the underlying root cause.
But it's comforting.
Yeah, it is comforting. Yes.
There's a perverse comfort in ascribing the evils of the world to some evil people, even if they are these, ultra powerful Illuminati that you could never take down. There's still a comfort there because in principle, at least you know what to do. You know how to solve the problem. It's to take those fuckers down.
Yes.
But that vent, that outlet for the energy of not knowing what to do does us a huge disservice. Because if we could stew in the helplessness and not divert onto a ready false solution, maybe we'd be able to actually find some real solutions.
Right. And we talked about this a bit yesterday, but I think there's a concrete example of the efficacy of rehumanization in restorative justice. And maybe there is a restorative politics that can mirror some of the qualities of restorative justice that addresses the harm done to the victim, is not just focused on punishment for the assailant, actually humanizes the assailant and tries to understand the conditions from which they came that led them to that behavior, that actually tries to create a direct communication between victim and assailant that is humanizing. I wonder how that could be done in politics, because there was a time when it wasn't as vitriolic, right? It's sort of there's kind of a nostalgia to that too, where it was a bunch of cigar smoking plutocrats on the left, on the right, having a drink in a back room, kind of just chumming, working its stuff out. Or the Rockefeller Republicans that were somewhat moderate. But now, there's so much vitriol, right? It's so much atomization, fracturization, or fractured nature to debate. Is there sort of a model for, I suppose, restorative politics?
I think that the warfare that we see among our political figures, it's an outgrowth of a more generalized polarization of society, or even a barometer of that.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think that there is a path toward a restorative politics. It involves rehumanization, just as restorative justice puts victim and perpetrator together and offers the opportunity for apology and forgiveness, offers an opportunity for each to really hear the other's story. That's what's rehumanizing. To hear your story, if I hear the story of why you locked me in the closet and starved me for 4 days when I thought I was coming here to record a course, like,
I'm sorry. But that's how we got you up here. And then, of course, there's the reality of the torture chamber. But yeah.
Right. But if I understand, like, your whole background, and I'm like, oh, I understand now why you did that, then there's a possibility of real forgiveness.
Yeah.
Real forgiveness is difficult. Real forgiveness is not an act of indulgence. That's fake forgiveness. Real forgiveness only comes through a meeting of the souls. And one way to do that is to tell your story and to have that story really be heard. So I think politically, we can do the same to create conditions, and starting at the grassroots even, not necessarily just the leaders, but starting at the grassroots where people can hear each other's stories. Then they can't dehumanize each other anymore.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think what it is in some ways, we were talking about Hannah Arendt a bit, which is essentially, she would claim that essentially the conditions that lead to like authoritarianism, totalitarianism, are like a real sense for belonging that is missing, that there is no identity, so then you can roll in with a red cap and, fancy slogan and get people all riled up, kind of ratchet up the fear, serve up an enemy, and off you go. But that really what we're lacking is sort of what you're saying, which are forums for the exchange of ideas amongst free individuals, or the exchange of stories that can essentially create a level of humanization. I mean, I guess the dominant narrative in American culture is like, oh, we've got a bunch of liberal cappuccino sipping folks on the coasts, and then we've got like a bunch of folks in kind of agrarian and manufacturing Rust Belt, Midwest flyover states or whatever, and that have been quote unquote left behind, and that these are the folks that then like essentially out of desperation, fear, whatever, voted for Trump. Like, this is the narrative, and that are there ways to essentially create forums where people can hear each other again, because it's hard to hate up close.
It's hard to hate up close. Yeah, and one of these Trump voting, quote, deplorables,
right?
If you really hear their life story, you can't deplore them.
No.
You can't hate them.
Yeah.
And the same thing, like if one of them could hear the story of an illegal immigrant who,
it's the same story.
Yeah,
yes.
like these are heartbreaking stories.
Yeah.
What it takes for somebody to leave their family and come with their children with no guarantee that they're ever going to make it. I mean, and the horrors that happen to them. You cannot hear those stories and uphold the standard right-wing, narrative about the immigrants.
Yeah.
You don't have to even see the paradigm of punishment that you were referencing before just keeps coming back and back and back. It's like it can become like, well, let's make them feel bad by telling the story as an act of violence. There has to be an attitude of generosity and of peace in the sharing of stories. Because, I could say more about punishment. I mean, there's...
Do you think, I'd like to talk about that. I'm also I want to continue to mine this story component and how we actually create structures for this exchange of story and idea. I mean, is it that what we need to return to is more local, decentralized forms of community? I read this quote the other day. I think John Maynard Keynes quote: "It's easier to ship recipes than cakes and biscuits," which is sort of like on the surface, kind of like neither here nor there. But then when you essentially think of like, well, this pen the ink was probably made somewhere, and then this was made in China, and then it was shipped over here, and now we're sitting here in Topanga. That like essentially, that we've developed great piping to share information and technology or recipes, essentially, and is the part of the solution being able to create structures and systems that reward sort of distributed leadership, decentralized organization, where people are actually can have that exchange of story. And what does that look like?
Yeah, the answer to the question is yes.
Yeah.
As far as what does it look like?
I mean, I look at models like AA.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one.
The decentralization of production, and the distribution of production for most things makes a lot of sense and would certainly bring more connection and community and meaning into people's lives. There are some things that do not suit themselves toward local production.
Yeah.
Microchips and things like that,
right.
Perhaps. But most things that are produced globally should be much more local. Food, shelter, entertainment. But I think there's another level too, that even the recipes should be more local.
Right, yeah.
Because they reference local conditions and, properly speaking, should come from local culture, which is not just a decoration on a place, but is actually rooted in and part of a place, even an outgrowth of a place. The culture is part of the land. The land is part of the culture. Yeah. So when you're talking about recipes, you're talking about a cultural product that I think also should be decentralized. But at the same time, there is this whole ascent of humanity to a mass global society has also happened for a reason. So it's not to, I don't advocate completely dismantling the collective global intelligence, but to revalidate the other levels of organization and intelligence.
Right. Yeah. It's an interesting, I suppose, dichotomy where sort of like I think this bucolic vision of liberal democracy has been kind of this globalism, slightly kumbaya vision of the world. And that is essentially, has led to a lot of these modern issues and problems. At the same time, at the root of it, I think is like there's a benevolence at the root of it, which is that, that is kind of Judeo-Christian in a way of like, hey, we're all equal and God made all of our souls equally and will judge us all equally. But that globalism flies kind of directly into the face of more kind of decentralized organization for society. I look at like the blue zones being like interesting examples, like these kind of little enclaves around the world, and I think there's 5 of them where people are like cognitively and physiologically thriving into their hundreds in like Icaria, Greece, and these places that seem like to have maintained their local cultures and traditions. You can be like, well, they walk a lot and they have a good diet. All that thing's true too, but I think what you're saying is that they have maintained a sense of their own identity that isn't global.
Right. Yeah. The point you were making about fascism, I think, is important. And it's also the same point to be made about consumerism, because a lot of excess consumption is an attempt to construct an identity using brands and things. So somebody who has lost the cultural stories that attach them to place and to community is a ripe target for consumerism and for fascism, because if you don't have rich multi-dimensional relationships with the people and place, you don't know who you are. And the fascist, or even Donald Trump, I mean, this is true of every party. You know, they come in and say, "Here's who you are."
Yeah.
And if you are in that identity crisis, that's really compelling. Here's who you are. Here's a story that gives meaning to life.
Yes. Yeah.
And you're not going to examine it very deeply.
There you go. I'll put that shirt on.
Yeah, you put the shirt
Put
on.
the fucking hat on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because what else do you have?
Yeah.
You're disaffiliated.
Right.
You probably live somewhere else than where your family grew up. You don't work for the family business. You maybe don't even go to church. Like, so
if there is still a family business. I mean, you know, that's
Right.
a strong piece of identity, a family business.
Yes.
But how many family businesses have succumbed to, you know, Dunkin' Donuts and Walmart and Amazon,
Yes.
where you become an interchangeable cog in the machine?
Yeah. I want to talk, to round it out, about a bit about regenerative agriculture, and its role in climate change. Some people don't like the word climate change. I don't know where you are on that. Paul Hawken is like, it's not about chance global warming. Stop using mitigating language. I don't really know. But because I met you through Ryland Engelhardt and the Kiss the Ground folks, and we actually did a course with them around soil and the carbon sequestration properties of soil. That honestly was, I thought it was like, this is a very philanthropic thing to do with them, and we'll put it on the platform, and it'll be like, look like we're fulfilling like our role as like a good social impact conscious company. I mean, admittedly, it was a little bit of that. It was, and it was so popular. I mean, we had like 30 some odd thousand people sign up for that thing. I'm like, well, they're not going to be all farmers, obviously. But I wonder how you think about regenerative agriculture, how you understand it in the overall context of climate change and addressing it.
Yeah. Climate change is another issue that my opinion is off the spectrum of opinion, which is defined on the one end
That's your happy place.
by catastrophe, and on the other end by skepticism or denialism, as you might call it. I prefer skepticism. This is one of my operating principles, is that in any polarized debate, the key to the debate lies in what neither side is talking about, or in the assumptions that they both share unconsciously. And one of them is that in the environmental issue, the most important thing to be talking about is carbon. So Kiss the Ground, I am a big proponent, enthusiastic proponent of regenerative agriculture. But for me, it's not because of carbon sequestration. It's because I understand soil as one of the organs of a living being called Gaia, or called Earth. I understand that without healthy soil, Earth will survive no better than you would survive without skin. Yes, it sequesters carbon, or helps modulate the levels of carbon in the atmosphere, but in my mind, more importantly, it helps to regulate the water cycle. Healthy soil absorbs rainfall that would otherwise run off and be a flood, and then as it absorbs it, replenishes aquifers and waters plants, trees especially, grasses, that then transpire the water into what would otherwise be the dry season, creating clouds, recycling that moisture as rain, extending the dry season. So thereby first mitigating floods and then preventing drought. Someone was telling me they were in, I think it was Jamaica or something, one of the Caribbean nations, where in the recent hurricane, none of the villages that had intact coastal wetlands suffered any loss of life. It was only the ones where there had been development and wetlands draining where there had been catastrophe, because these wetlands, absorb the incoming water. And the same thing happens for land-based wetlands. So basically what I'm seeing, and this is part of the basic mentality of warfare, which is that if you want to solve a situation, solve a problem, the first thing you do is you find the enemy, or you find the one thing to attack.
Yeah.
So carbon dioxide fits the bill.
Right.
It's one thing to attack. Better yet, it's quantifiable. So we can use all of the methods and mindsets of accounting to minimize a number.
Yes.
And I think that, as in any kind of reductionism, the important stuff gets left out. So I personally do not think that global warming per se is the biggest threat. I think that it could easily result from ecocide, from the destruction of the organs of Gaia that, just like your organs, help maintain homeostasis.
Right.
But we could equally see catastrophic cooling or catastrophic fluctuations. There's a lot more to, I wrote a whole book on this, so it's hard for me to summarize it now, but just as an example of the real issue being off the radar screen of conventional polarized positions.
Yes. It's almost like you are a functional medicine doctor applying the theories of functional medicine outside of medicine on some level, like to climate, to politics, that always not really, I mean, it's not that the orthodoxy and the conversation up here doesn't matter, but that there is a root cause that really is the thing that needs to be focused on. And, it's funny that I'm having sort of like minor epiphany right now about what you're saying, and like this regenerative agriculture course that we did, because my sense is that of those 30 some odd thousand people that signed up for that course, how many people are going to be a regenerative, like agricultural farmer? 5, 3, 10, 20, 50? I don't know. But my sense is that it is that there is a thirst to feel a part of nature where people have felt so divorced from it. And I think that might have been the reason why people they're innately drawn to this notion of connection, and don't have always all the resources available to get to that.
Yeah. And I think maybe we could wrap up by saying that actually answers the question that you posed earlier. Like, what is the nature of this movement that will reverse the tide of separation?
Yeah.
And it is exactly this, it's reunion, it's reconnection, powered by what you're describing, this yearning to connect to nature again, to be part of the global reuniting of all that we have separated off.
Yeah.
All of the beings, all of the people, the races, the cultures, the living things of this earth, to come together again. I think this is the tide of our time that will carry us into a much more beautiful future.
Yeah. Thank you for coming to a strange place called Commune, where there's no internet. Of course, there's internet here, but as you arrive here, you lose all signal. You have to confront any fear that there might be like 40 naked people having sex or something.
Well,
like
I did
that.
have a momentary panic attack when it said no service on my phone, but I worked through it.
Good for you. And it is a distinct pleasure to also meet someone that's forsaken all of health and beauty aid products like myself, and we can compare how long we've gone without washing our hair.
How long we say beautiful, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Charles.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm Jeff Krasno, and welcome to Commune, where every week we explore the ideas, values, and practices that bring us together and help us live healthy and purpose-filled lives. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We hope you'll join us.